Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. Today, um, I know I sound a little excited. We're starting a new chapter, uh, the Great Depression. Yeah, the Great Depression. So let's get into it. And of course, you got to match the theme with the Google slide theme, black background. All right, so remember this is a two title note day, meaning you should put the Great Depression in your notes. You should put the Great Depression in the top of the margin. All right, the Great Depression, module 9, chapter 9, whatever you want to call it. Today we're going to look at the nation's sick economy. Like sick, bro. No, not like that. Okay, so you should put this at either the first line or the bottom half of the margin. The nation's sick economy, module 9, lesson 1. That was your warm up. Objectives, we're going to assess why the diminished demand in agriculture and the economy affected farmers and businesses I don't know why I have it as a question mark. Businesses in the 1920s. Discover how the economy of the late 1920s affected the election of 1928, and critique how the stock market crash helped cause the Great Depression. All right, preying on the downfall. So, as the 1920s advanced, serious problems threatened economic prosperity. The government's laissez-faire economic policies will play a part. Remember, laissez-faire, hands off, no government intervention. During the decade, high tariffs had protected some businesses, but it hurt international trade and weakened European economies. Taxes on the richest Americans and businesses were reduced. As a result, the government revenues dropped and federal spending declined. Meanwhile, some businesses thrived, which made a few people rich. Many Americans, however, could not earn a decent living. Industries that had once been central to the American economy struggled. Farmers will grow more crops and raise more livestock than they could sell at a profit. And both consumers and farmers were steadily going deeper and deeper into debt. And so it's kind of like that other lecture in the last chapter where called it superficial prosperity, where all those things that we took notes on about the 1920s, couple that with all the highs and lows, and then couple that with people going deeper and deeper into debt and not giving a what. All right, over it. So the superficial prosperity, there's that word again, of the late 20s, mass weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key basic industries such as railroads, textiles, steel had barely made a profit. Railroads lost businesses to new forms of transportation, trucks, buses, and private automobiles. As these industries declined, they laid off workers or reduced their hours. When you're not working as much, you're not making that money. Mining and lumbering, which expanded during the war, were no longer in high demand. Coal mining was especially hit hard, in part due to stiff competition from new forms of energy, including hydroelectric power, fuel oil, and natural gas. Overproduction, however, weakened even the boom industries of the 20s, automobiles, construction, and consumer goods. As credit had allowed these businesses to expand, they had manufactured far more products than consumers could afford to buy. If only that were true nowadays. Another economic indicator that declined was the number of new houses being built. Real estate prices were too high for too many people. Check out the Bay Area if you need an example. So when housing starts to fall, so do jobs in the many related industries like furniture manufacturing, lumbering, because you build houses with wood. So here's lots of bales of cotton just sitting there doing nothing. We are farmers. Agriculture, however, will suffer the most. During World War I, prices rose and international demand for crops like wheat and corn soared so that the troops could be fed. Farmers planted more and took out more loans for land and equipment. However, demand fell after the war, and a lot of people dead, and crop prices declined by 40% or more. And then you have something called deflation. Test question. Deflation is the decrease in general price level of goods and services, and those will take hold of the economy. Farmers boosted production. They increased their production in hopes of selling more crops, but this will only drop prices further. Again, if you have too much of a good in the market, the price is. Farmers who had gone into debt had a hard time paying off their loans. Again, when there's too much of something, the prices go down. So you have to sell it at that price, thus not making much profit. And when you can't make that much profit, you can't pay back your loans. So many farmers will lose their farms as banks foreclosed on them and seized their property as payment for the debt. As farmers began to default on their loans, many rural banks began to fail because if banks don't get money, how do you run a bank with no money? Congress tried to help out farmers with a piece of legislation called the McNary-Hagan bill. That word threw me for a loop, which called for the federal price supports for key products like corn, cotton, wheat, and tobacco. The government would buy surplus crops at guaranteed prices and sell them on the world market. That sounds great. Calvin Coolidge, our president at the time, vetoed this bill twice. It passed the House, it passed the Senate, and when I got to him, he said, "Nuh-uh," 2 times. He commented, "Farmers have never made money. I don't believe we can do much about it." Listen, I understand what you might be going through, but that is some of the most idiotic statements I've ever heard. Nothing we can do much about it. Wow. Here are farmers. Here is a foreclosure. And here is Calvin Coolidge on the left. His successor, Herbert Hoover, on the right. And that statement made me call Calvin Coolidge a dum-dum. And if you remember watching Night at the Museum, and you have this big statue that talks, and his name is Dum Dum, or he calls Ben Stiller Dum Dum. I want some gum gum. That's all I thought about when I heard that statement. All right, larger than life. As farmers' income fell, they bought fewer goods and services, but the problem was much larger than that. By the late 1920s, Americans were buying less, mainly because of the rising prices, stagnant wages, unbalanced distribution of income, and overbuying on credit in the preceding years. Production had also expanded much faster than wages, resulting in an ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. And although many Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 20s, they were in fact living beyond their means. They often bought goods on credit, the buy now, pay later method for purchases. Test question. This was often in the form of an installment plan that included interest charges. By making credit more available easily for consumers, businesses also encouraged Americans to pile up large consumer debt. Many had trouble paying off what they owed on their purchases, which will lead consumers cutting back on their spending. If they can't afford it, they can't pay for it. During the 20s, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. The wealthiest 1% of the population, their annual income rose 75%. Compared to all Americans, 9% increase in 1929. More than 70% of the nation's families earn less than $2,500 per year, which was considered at the time the minimum amount needed for a decent standard of living. The unequal distribution of income meant that most Americans could not participate fully in the economic advances of the 20s, like all those dishwashers, those stoves, refrigerators, irons, vacuum cleaners. The prosperity of the era rested on a fragile foundation. There you go. Buy now, pay later. All right. So although the economic disaster was coming around the corner, she'll be coming around the corner when she comes. The election in 1928 took place in a mood of apparent national prosperity. You had Republican candidate Herbert Hoover versus Democrat Alfred E. Smith. And if you remember, Alfred E. Smith, Democrat from New York, a Catholic. Who do you think was going against Catholics at this time? Think about it. Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. Smith was a career politician who had served 4 terms as governor of New York. Hoover had one major advantage. He could use the prosperity of the 20s to signal that, hey, if you want to keep this prosperity train going, elect a Republican. For Hoover, the American system of government was the opposite of governments in Europe. He believed that a focus on individual achievement made the U.S. great. According to Herbert Hoover, a shift away from this focus would destroy the nation. Again, remember, communism is taking root in Europe. The Soviet Union has formed. Stalin is in charge. So things are happening over there, where it's more communal based, no I in communism. The confidence in the American spirit helped many believe him when he said, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly won. The message was received. Americans were satisfied with Republican leadership. No matter how hard the KKK, well, never mind. The KKK helped probably Herbert Hoover win, thanks to Alfred E. Smith running. Because, you know, KKK don't like Catholics. Herbert Hoover, babyface. All right. If you know who Mike Jones is, then you get this title. By 1929, some economists had warned of the weaknesses in the economy, but most... Where's my... Hello? There we go. But most Americans maintained the utmost confidence in the nation's economic health. In increasing numbers, those who could afford it invested in the stock market. The stock market had become the most viable symbol of a prosperous American economy. Then, as in now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was most widely used barometer of the stock market's health. The Dow is a measure based on the stock prices of 30 representative large firms trading on the New York Stock Exchange. I want to say there are more nowadays. Through most of the 20s, stock prices rose steadily. The Dow had reached a high of 381 points, nearly 300 points higher than it had been 5 years earlier. Talk about prosperity. Eager to take advantage of this bull market, test question. This whole thing is a test question. There are probably 2 separate test questions talking about the Dow Jones and obviously bull market. So the bull market is a period of rising stock prices. Americans will rush to buy stocks and bonds. By 1929, about 4 million Americans, or 3% of the population, owned stocks. Many of these investors were already wealthy, but others were average Americans who hoped to strike it rich. So, you know, a lot is said about this time, about the stock market crashing and so many people losing their money, when in fact, it only turns out that 3%, maybe even close, I wouldn't even say 5%, own stocks by the time it crashes. Spoiler, it does. And so 3% of the population, that's nothing. 4 million Americans? So you have a country of over 100 million Americans, and you're telling me only 4 were invested in the stock market? But see, that's where it's like 4 million Americans were only affected, but you have other things that are connected to the stock market. That's the bull outside. I believe that's outside the stock market in New York City. Bull for the bull market. All right, Wolf of Wall Street. However, the seeds of trouble were taking root. These next 2 are test questions. People were engaging in speculation. That is, they thought they bought stocks and bonds on the chance for a quick profit while ignoring the risks. So, if a company's doing well, you're making profit too. But if a company's not doing well, just because you think they're a cheap stock price to buy, to purchase, and then you want to sell it, not how it's going to work, my guy. Many people began buying on margin, which is paying a small percentage of stock prices as a down payment and borrowing the rest. So with easy money available to investors, the unrestrained buying and selling fueled the market's upward spiral. The government did little to discourage such buying or to regulate the market. In reality, these rising prices did not reflect companies' net worth. Worse, if the value of stocks declined, the people who bought on margin will have no way to pay off the loans. And so that's why all this culminating together, you have people paying a small percentage of a stock, $5 for $100 worth of stock, $5 down. And when they try and sell it, that money of the $95 per that share still needs to be paid, and it doesn't get paid. There's a lot of money floating around that, in fact, people didn't have that much money. The trend of buying on margin troubled the governing board of the Federal Reserve System, aka the Fed. The Fed had been created in 1913 to serve as the nation's central bank, a role it continues to fill today. The Fed sets monetary policy to promote economic growth. Test question. In the 1920s, the Fed decided to make it harder for brokers to offer margin loans to investors. That was partly successful. Borrowing from banks decreased, but large corporations began providing brokers with the cash to make margin loans. So now you have banks, you have large corporations providing that money so that they can get more money for their stock. A little insider trading, don't you think? As a result, the run-up of the stock market continued despite the Fed's shift in monetary policy, which was slightly working. So here's a graphic of car sales from GM, General Motors. They sold about 587,000 worth of cars or 587,000 cars in 1924. But their acceptance through credit was retail 653,000, wholesale 494,000. So a total whopping of 1 million cars sold, giving the amount of credit of $810 million, which we've looked at money for the 1920s. That is absurd. You have all that money floating around. It's not actual cash. You know what I'm saying? Again, credit. Buy now, pay later. So in early September 1929, stock prices peaked, then fell. Confidence in the market started to waver, and some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out. On October 24th, the market took a huge plunge. Panic investors unloaded their shares, but the worst was still to come. On October 29th, 1929, test question, it's known as Black Tuesday. The bottom fell out of the market and the nation's confidence. The stock market crashed. Plain and simple. I know it doesn't say that, but look at the title. Shareholders frantically tried to sell theirs shares before prices dropped even lower. The number of shares dumped onto the market that day was a record of 16.4 million. So people got rid of their stock, 16.4 million shares. Additional millions of shares could not find the buyers, though. People who had bought stock on credit were stuck with huge debt, as well as plummeting as the prices plummeted, while others just lost all their savings. By mid-November, investors had lost about $30 billion, almost the equivalent of how much the United States spent on World War I. The stock market bubble finally bursted. Wall Street can panic as stocks crash. Attempt made. Oh, wait, that's not. That's not the title. Billions lost as stocks crash. All right, so the Great Depression begins. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, the period from 1929 through the 1930s in which the economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. The crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it had hastened the collapse of the economy and made the depression more severe. After the crash, many people panicked and withdrew their money from banks. However, some couldn't get their money because the banks had no money as well. Banks use that money to invest their cash in the stock market. So in 1929, 600 banks closed, and by 1933, 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks closed, failed. Yeah. Because the government did not provide protection or insurance of bank accounts, millions of people lost their money. The Fed might have supplied more money to banks, but there was rules linking currency to gold reserves that hampered those efforts. The Federal Reserve, if you don't know, they can cure our economy like that. So whenever you hear news about the Fed, take a listen, take a gander, pay attention. The Fed, however, saw these bank failures in a positive light. It got rid of those bad money managers. Again, you have people putting their faith, their trust in banks, and you have banks trying to get rich off the prosperity of the 20s, investing people's money in the stock market. And when the banks invested money and then the stock market crashes, banks lost money, people are trying to get money from the banks, and then banks have no money. It is what it is. The Great Depression also hit other businesses along with banks. 1929 to 1932, the GNP, gross national product, the nation's total output of goods and services, was cut nearly in half from $104 billion to $59 billion. Approximately 90,000 businesses went bankrupt, like the once prosperous automobile and railroad companies of the day. Here you have people lining up outside a bank trying to get that money. No job, no life. The crash affected businesses in another way too. Prior to the crash, businesses had attracted a large amount of capital for investment in new machinery, new markets, and other ventures. With the crash, Americans lost confidence in business, and business in turn lost confidence in the consumers. Businesses reduced their investments, which cascaded into reducing their workforce. As the economy plunged into a tailspin, millions of workers lost their jobs. Unemployment jumped from 3%, roughly 1.6 million workers, in 1929 to 25%. The worst year of the Depression, 13 million workers. 1 out of every 4 people were out of a job, and those who kept their jobs faced pay cuts or reduced hours. Free donuts for the unemployed. International issues. Due to growth in international trade, many of the world's nations had become interdependent. However, when the U.S. economy failed, American investors withdrew their money from European markets. As a result, the U.S. was not the only country that was gripped by the Great Depression. Most of Europe suffered throughout the 1920s. European countries trying to recover from the ravages of World War I faced high war debt, so their economies were already unstable. In addition, Germany had to pay those war reparations from the Treaty of Versailles. The Great Depression compounded these problems by limiting America's ability to import European goods. This made it difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad. Eventually, countries all around the world would be affected by the financial collapse as unemployment rates soared and prices plummeted in Europe. Austria's largest bank failed, for example. In Asia, both farmers and urban workers suffered as the value of exports fell between half between 1929 and 1931. In Latin America, a decrease in U.S. and European demand for their products caused prices to fall: sugar, beef, copper. In 1930, test question, Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which established the highest protective tariff in U.S. history. Remember what a tariff is? You remember. It was designed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition, but it had the opposite effect. By reducing the flow of goods in the U.S., the tariff prevented other countries from earning American currency to buy American goods. The tariff made unemployment worse in industries that could no longer export goods to Europe. Many countries retaliated with their own tariffs when within a few years, world trade had fallen by more than 40%. High tariff on what the farmers buy. Sweet cookie, I wonder how much this animal eats. Causes. Historians and economists agree to a common list of factors that caused the Great Depression. Tariff and war debt policies that reduced the foreign market for American goods. There was a crisis in the farm sector, the availability of easy credit, and unequal distribution of income. These factors led to a falling demand for consumer goods, even as newly mechanized factories produced more products. The federal government contributed to the crisis by keeping interest rates low, thereby allowing companies and individuals to borrow easily and build up large debts. At first, people found it hard to believe that the economic disaster had struck. And by November 1929, Herbert Hoover encouraged Americans to remain confident about the economy. Yet the most severe depression in American history was about to show up. And that concludes our lecture. I know a little sadness, a little bit of sadness in my life. Sorry for singing. And yeah, so what a time to be alive during this time, right? I believe my grandpa lived through the Great Depression. He was born in 1925. So tough times, tough times. All right, enough about me. Your homework is page 420. 420, questions 3 and 4. So hopefully, I know it was a little bit longer. I talked a little bit more. There were more slides to talk about. But hopefully we have a good grasp of how the Great Depression started. So yeah, if you guys did enjoy that, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.